Hi. Okay, so today we're going to talk about wages and paying wages to family members. So, in a session I did about 2 weeks ago, we talked about how one of the advantages of being in business is the availability or the possibility of splitting income with family members. So, today we're going to a little bit into that and kind of talk about what can be done and how much you can do. And because it's a question I get asked a lot. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the advantage of paying wages to a child or to a spouse. So let's start with the spouse. If you are in a higher marginal tax rate, in other words, in a higher bracket, and let's just say, for example, that you're taxed at 40%, and your spouse, on the other hand, is earning less income than you are, and say has a marginal tax rate of only 25%, then the advantage of paying a spouse a wage of, say, pick a number, $10,000. The $10,000, if you're in a higher marginal rate of 40%, for example, will save you about $4,000. Now, the spouse who receives that income will have to report that income on his or her tax return, resulting in a tax liability by the spouse of, say, $2,500, which is about 25% if they're in that tax bracket. So the savings in that case would be about 15%. So in other words, on a $10,000 wage paid to a spouse, you would go from paying $4,000 net 2,500. So you'd be saving yourself about $1,500 on a $10,000 wage. So it's advantageous to pay a spouse if the spouse is in a lower tax bracket than you are. But if their marginal tax rate is the same as yours, there's really no tax advantage of paying a spouse any kind of wages. And it's not to say that you shouldn't. Sometimes it can prevent a divorce. But from a tax perspective, the advantages aren't quite as significant if they're in the same marginal tax rate. Where it becomes really sweet and advantageous to pay wages to family members is when you can pay wages to your own children, because every person in Canada has the right to earn roughly about $10,000 without paying any taxes. So every time you pay a wage to your child, and let's just assume that the child has no other income, because most children under the age of 16, 17, 18 have very little, if any, wages earned elsewhere. So you can basically pay a wage to your child, and it will will not result in any taxes owing by the child. So using the same example of $10,000, the $10,000 that I pay my child as a wage will result in saving me between $2,500 to $4,000 in taxes, depending on what is my personal marginal rate. And the child will have to report the $10,000 on his or her return, but there shouldn't be any taxes owing if their total income is below $10,000. So it's a very lucrative net tax savings. So now that we've kind of understood the advantages of paying wages to a spouse, there's also risk in paying wages to a spouse or a child, because it has to be reasonable given the amount that they are receiving. So it's okay to pay a family member as long as what they are receiving by way of wage is what you'd be paying somebody else to do a similar task. So, for example, and the example I like to use in this is farmers, for example. So I was brought up and raised on a farm, and I remember, hell, by 6 years old, I was starting to drive the tractor a little bit. And by the time I was 12, I was driving the big tractors as any adult would. So cultivating and doing all of those things and working the land. So on a tractor, I was producing as much work, let's just say, than an adult would, because the tractor was not pulling less of a weight because it was a 12-year-old driving the tractor versus a full adult. So what is a reasonable wage to pay a 12-year-old driving a tractor who's doing the same amount of work and producing the same amount of labor, let's just say, than an adult? Well, the same thing you would pay an adult. So for you farmers out there who have children and you're paying your child, and you also hire your adult and you're paying your adult $30 per hour, to drive that tractor, it's reasonable for you to pay to your 12-year-old $30 an hour to drive the tractor to do the same amount of work. So again, what you got to compare is what is the production of the child versus what you would pay an adult to do the same kind of work. So where people need to get maybe creative, I don't know if that's the right word, but how do you get creative in paying wages to a child? So let's say you have an 8-year-old child. You said, well, what could my 8-year-old child be earning? What could that child possibly be doing? Well, it depends on what business you're in. So let's just say you're in construction and you're building houses or whatever. Well, at the end of your construction deal, odds are you're going to have someone come in and clean up and sweep all over the place, wash, and all of that. An 8-year-old might not be able to do quite a good job as an adult, but can certainly help in that area and help haul stuff out and things like that. So what would you pay an adult to do the same kind of work is what would be reasonable to pay the child. So what you got to come up is what is a reasonable wage for what the child is doing, and be thinking about all the things that the child can do that an adult could do. So again, haul materials, cleaning. For those of you who have more of an office kind of business, that person could help you with the mail outs. They can help you with shredding paper if you have confidential information needs shredding, things like that. So, and as the child gets older, of course, you can have the child do more and more higher end tasks that would be also done by an adult. But what I find really nice is when they get to an age of, say, 12 and up, what I found is at that age, their computer knowledge is often very high. So you can have them do pretty sophisticated research on Google. So let's just say you're needing information on something. You can start asking your children, can you find out all you can on this particular subject matter? And cut them loose and let them go on Google and find whatever information you're looking for. So that can be very, very nice way to get some work done by your child. And the best part is you could pay them a fairly handsome fee for doing that research and working and finding all those things. But the other thing that a child can also do, especially if you're like me, have no hair or white hair, my computer knowledge is not up to where I'd like it to be. And I find that my children are far, far better at it than I am. So you could probably, almost every child under the age of, over the age of 12 will be better at computers than I am, therefore be able to provide me with technical support. So again, don't forget to pay your child if they're helping you with your computer thing. So the computer is not printing for whatever reason. Rather than spending 3 hours trying to figure out why your printer is not working, let your 15-year-old child figure it out and pay them for doing your technical support and making that work. The other thing that's also important, so now we've determined what is a reasonable amount to pay. We've determined it is a good idea to pay your child, especially if they have no income. It's also a good idea to pay the spouse if they're in a lower marginal rate. We've also discussed how much you should pay them. But then the question is, how do you pay them? I think it's really important that you always have a track record of what was paid to them. So I've always been advising my clients, make sure you actually pay your child. Preferably not by cash, because cash does not leave you a proper paper trail of the amount that was paid to your child. So instead of paying them by cash, pay them in some other way. So either e-transfers, check is a phenomenal way, although it's kind of going a bit of the way of the dodo bird nowadays. But a mechanism of somehow where there is a paper trail showing the money leaving your business account or your personal account going into your child's account. So clearly that there has been a transfer of money, because lack of a transfer of money could result in CRA deeming that wages were actually never paid. Now, if the year is done, you're saying, oh my God, the year is done, I never paid my child a wage per way of check or any kind of paper trail. There is a court case that came out several years ago that was quite interesting. And if I remember correctly, and don't quote me on this, but I think it was a farmer who had hired his child to do a lot of labor on the farm. And rather than paying the child by check or some kind of monetary way, he had paid the child by way of buying the child a motorcycle, buying the insurance for the motorcycle, and also providing the fuel and all that to operate the motorcycle. And it came up to something like $7,000, if my memory serves me right. And he had been denied the expense because there was apparently no paper trail per se of the child receiving benefits for the work that he had done. And he went to court and he was able to prove to the court that, in fact, during the year, he did buy a motorcycle, pay for the fuel and all that for the child to operate the motorcycle. And therefore, it did become a wage expense, an allowable wage expense for the farmer. I don't recall whether or not the child had reported that income on his or her tax return, but I think that might have been part of the problem as well. If the child does not prepare a tax return, and let's face it, until they're taxable, there's no true obligation for the child to prepare a tax return. That might be part of the problem. So one of the things I always recommend is to play it safe. If you are going to pay a wage to your child, whatever wage that you've declared as an expense payable to your child, make sure the child prepares a tax return for that same amount and report it. And if you want to be ultra safe, T4 that income. So in other words, pay them by way of a T4, give them the wages, and at the end, provide a T4 for the child to report on his or her tax return. So those are all things that will give the whole transaction teeth. So just because the child doesn't have a T4 doesn't mean you can't deduct it. That's not what I'm saying. But it just gives the transaction more teeth, just as the child reporting the income that you've paid him or her will help put a bit more teeth into the fact that wages were in fact paid to the child. So Kayla, are there any questions so far?
Hey, Jungi.
Okay, hi.
So what happens if you overpay your spouse or child? What are the risks involved in that?
Okay, so that can happen. So for both a spouse and a child, what can happen is CRA, if they found that you've paid a child an amount that was unreasonable, what will happen is they will deny that expense on your tax return, but the child or spouse will still have to report that income being paid as a revenue. So it can result in double taxation. What I've understood, and that was true many years ago, how true it still is today, I imagine it still is, but CRE tend to challenge wages paid to a child a lot more than wages paid to a spouse. So I've always advised my clients, be extra careful of the amount that you pay to your child, because the odds are of that getting challenged is much greater. And again, make sure you got a paper trail. Wages paid to a spouse tends to get challenged a little bit less for reasonableness. And I think part of the reason for that is it's hard to justify or for CRA to prove that it's not reasonable. So to give you an example, let's go back to the farmer. I am a farmer and my spouse does work on the farm for me and I pay the spouse $50,000. How does CRE then determine that the $50,000 wage is not a reasonable amount for all the work that the spouse might be doing on the farm? It becomes a very difficult thing for them to defend, because the spouse, even if they're not doing much physical labor, so the spouse could never be going into the barn, not driving the tractor much and all of that, but that spouse could still play a very important role by way of management, helping in all the management decisions, possibly doing all of the internal bookkeeping and all of that. So that can be fairly a high-paying job, if you say. So I think that's the reason CRA tends to not take offense to wages paid to the spouse quite as much as wages paid to a child. Any other questions, Kayla?
We do. We have a question from Joshua. So, do you need to have a business in order to pay your child? For example, if you're a lawyer working from a law firm that's not your law firm, can you still hire your child to do some basic clerical work?
Yes and no. So in order for you to you can pay your child all you want. Whether or not you can deduct it or not is a whole different matter. If you're self-employed, then there's really no rules preventing you from doing that. But if you're an employee, sorry, a lawyer working for a firm of some kind, what would need to happen is your employer would need to sign off a declaration that says that you are required under contract to hire your own people to help you. So it's not uncommon, especially if you're in sales, even with lawyers, doctors, where a lot of the work will be done by your own team, where they're saying, here's what needs to happen, here's what needs to get done. And if you need help with that, well, you're going to have to get your own help. And in those cases, as long as you have it under contract that you are required by contract to hire your own people, most wages that you're going to be paying will be you'll be able to claim on your taxes, not as a self-employed expense, but rather as an employment expense. So that would be allowable. Anything else?
Right. No more questions at this time.
Okay. So as far as wages, like I said, paid to family members, that's about it. And again, if you remember those simple rules, right? Pay them as much as you can. Make sure that what you pay them is reasonable, and make sure you've got a proper paper trail. You're probably good to go. And one of the things that I recommend is that if you're not sure, talk to your accountant or call me. I guess that's the beauty of having years and years of experience. As you deal more and more with auditors, we know what CRA takes offense to, what are the things that tend to be pushing the line, and we can probably advise you as to what is a reasonable wage to pay a child for different tasks. And again, there's no age limit. And that's the other question I get. Well, how young can I start paying them? Well, there is no age limit. I still remember a few years ago, I had made a presentation like this on taxes, and a lady put up her hand and said, can I pay my 2-month-old baby a wage? And I kind of chuckled at the question. I figured, well, okay, I'd like to hear your explanation as to how a wage to a 2-month-old baby could be reasonable at any amount. And she explained that her husband was a photographer, and every now and then, to demonstrate the kind of pictures that he could take in his photography business, he would hire these models, these babies, to pose as models to show the kind of pictures he could take. And he says, and she proceeded to say, well, my baby's as cute as any of the models we've ever hired. So if we pay these babies $300 to act as models for my husband to show off his photography, could we pay our baby $300? And of course, in this scenario, it would be reasonable, because if you're in the habit of paying $300 for other babies to pose as models, there's none to prevent you from paying your own baby $300 to pose. So I think that's a kind of a nice way of looking as to what's reasonable and how to look at it. So unless it's something that came up in the last second, Kayla, we are probably going to call it a day. Anything else, Kayla?
No questions at this time. If anybody listening does have a question, please post it to chat and we'll answer it live.
Yes. And by all means, if this thing is all over and you're listening to a recorded version, email me your question. I'll be happy to do my best to answer your questions. All right. Thank you. And till next week.